Montana Territory, 1882. The snow had not yet fallen, but the wind carried the bite of it as Caroline Zeller trudged up the narrow trail leading into the pines. One boot nearly soleless, the other soaked through. Her skirts were torn at the hem, her arms wrapped tight around her two children, Daisy, aged 6 and quiet from shock, and Daniel, only 4, clinging to her waist with sleep-heavy eyes. They had not eaten since yesterday morning. The cabin had not looked like much when she spotted it through the trees. Slanted roof, chimney crumbling at the edges, smoke curling from it like a promise she did not dare believe. But she had knocked anyway because there was nowhere else. And when the door opened, standing there was a man with a rifle in one hand and a trail-worn face that went still the second he saw her. "You look like hell," he said, voice low and steady, eyes moving from her to the kids and back again. "We need help," she rasped. "Please." The man stepped back without another word, letting her and the children inside. Heat hit her in the face, the kind that comes from a real fire and not just smoke. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and old leather. A stew pot hung over the fire, bubbling slow. Caroline felt her knees give, and she dropped to the floor with a gasp. "Sit," the man said, setting his rifle against the wall. "I will get you food." She watched him ladle stew into tin bowls, watched his shoulders move beneath a worn flannel shirt, his hair the color of dust and sunlight. When he handed her the bowl, his hand brushed hers. "Warm, steady." "I'm Holden Fairburn," he said. "This is my place." Caroline nodded. "Caroline Zeller. These are my children, Daisy and Daniel." Daniel had already fallen asleep on the bearskin rug, curled like a pup. Daisy was spooning stew to her mouth without a sound, her eyes never leaving Holden. "You alone out here?" she asked. Holden's mouth worked before he spoke. "Been that way a while." "You?" "My husband left us. Took the wagon and ran south 3 weeks back. Said he'd send for us. Never did." Holden's eyes darkened. "You walked out here?" "Had no choice." He nodded once, slow. "You can stay. For now." She wanted to say thank you, but the words stuck in her throat. That night, while the children slept curled together under a quilt Holden gave them, Caroline sat at the hearth, her legs drawn up, watching the flames. Holden handed her a cup of coffee, hot and black. "I know it ain't much," she said. "Your cabin. Just a roof and 4 walls." Holden looked at her, his eyes catching the firelight. "It's everything with you in it." Caroline blinked. Her throat tightened. "You don't even know me." He shrugged. "I know what I see. A woman who walked miles through wild country to protect her kids. That tells me enough." She looked down at the cup in her hands. Her fingers were still raw from the cold, her boots ruined, her heart numb. But a part of her stirred at the way he looked at her, not like she was broken, but like she mattered. The next morning, Holden chopped wood while Caroline boiled water and scrubbed the children's clothes. Daniel trailed after Holden, sticking close, while Daisy sat beside Caroline, finally asking questions in a soft voice. "Will we stay here?" "I do not know yet," Caroline answered. Holden came back inside with an armful of wood and set it by the hearth. "You should." Caroline looked up at him. "You do not know what you are offering." "Yes, I do. A roof, safety, food. It ain't much, but it is honest." Caroline stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. "Do you offer that to anyone who knocks on your door?" "No," he said, his voice quiet. "Just you." That night, when the children were asleep, Holden offered her the bed and said he would take the floor. She argued, but he would not hear it. "I do not let guests sleep on the floor," he said. "I am not a guest," she said. "I am a burden." He stepped close, not touching her, just standing there, tall and solid. "You are not. Not to me." She opened her mouth, then closed it. She lay in his bed that night, the blanket pulled to her chin, listening to his breath from the floor. She had not felt safe in months. Now somehow she did. The days that followed built a rhythm. Holden hunted, chopped, fixed what was broken. Caroline mended, cooked, washed. The children began to laugh again. Daniel followed Holden like a shadow. Daisy helped with cooking. Caroline's hands healed. Her heart too, though she did not admit it. One morning, a storm rolled through. Snow came early, heavy and wet. The wind screamed outside. The cabin held. Caroline stood by the window, watching flakes swirl. Holden came up behind her. "Winter's early this year," he said. "I was not ready for it." "You are still standing," he said. "That counts for something." She turned toward him. "Why are you doing this, Holden?" He looked down at her. "Because you walked into this place and made it feel like a home for the first time in 5 years." She swallowed. "I do not know what comes next." "I do," he said simply. "We make a life. Here. Together." She stared at him, stunned. "You want that. I want you. And your kids. All of it." She looked at him then, really looked. His face was rough from wind and sun, his hands calloused, his eyes clear. He meant it. Caroline stepped closer. Her hand found his. "I never thought I would get another chance," she whispered. "You do now," he said. "And so do I." The snow deepened quick as October closed its teeth around the land. Each morning, Holden split more wood than the one before, stacking it high along the wall beneath the eaves. Caroline watched him from the doorway, a wool shawl drawn tight over her shoulders, the frost in her breath matching the sharp white of the cottonwoods beyond. Daisy sat on the floor near the hearth, threading pine needles into a circle, her small fingers nimble. Daniel had taken to curling beside the dog Holden, had once rescued half-starved from a trapline, the boy's voice low and steady as he told its secrets. Inside, Holden's cabin had begun to change around them. Caroline had stitched new curtains from the muslin left in her bundle, and a narrow shelf now held a row of tin cups and a single blue plate that had survived the journey west. She had scrubbed the floor with lye and hot water until the knots in the wood showed their rings again. The cabin no longer looked like a place men passed through. It looked settled. It looked lived in. One evening, Holden returned with a brace of grouse and blood on his wrist. Caroline saw it before he could turn away. What happened? He knelt near the fire, unbuckling his belt knife. Took a fall on the ridge. Caught my hand on shale. You ought to clean it right. I will. She crossed the room and took his wrist without asking. The cut wasn't deep, but it was jagged, red with grit. She poured boiled water into a basin and dipped a clean scrap of flannel into it, then began washing the wound. You always this stubborn? He didn't look at her. Not always. I don't believe you. He gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. You'd be right. When she finished binding the cut, she looked up and caught him watching her, his face unreadable. You've got a careful way, he said. Like someone used to tending things that matter. I was a midwife before we left Kansas. Folks trusted me to bring new life into this world. Hard to forget how that feels. He nodded, slowly. You miss it. I miss being useful. You are. She held his gaze, steady as the fire beside them. Don't say things just to be kind. I don't. Never learned how. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, whistling low through the chinks. She turned her face toward the sound. Does it ever feel quiet to you? Out here. Sometimes, he said. But lately, not so much. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Holden sat at the table sharpening his knife by lantern light. Caroline worked on mending a rip in Daniel's trousers, but her hands moved slower than usual. What made you come this far north? He asked without looking up. My brother was supposed to meet us in Deer Lodge. He had land there. Wrote us letters about it, green pastures, elk in the hills. Said we'd be safe. You never made it? No. My husband sold the draft horse in Billings. Told me he'd find us another way forward. But he didn't come back. Holden stopped drawing the stone. You waited. 3 days. Then I walked. He set the knife down, stood, and crossed to the stove to check the coals. You could have died out there with those children. I knew that. You did it anyway. I couldn't sit and starve. When he turned back, his eyes had gone still again, like a pond frozen over. I know what it's like to wait for someone who won't return. She didn't press. Whatever loss he carried, it had settled deep and long ago. But he had let it show just for a breath, and that was enough. The next morning, Caroline rose early. She stepped outside into the hush of new snow and began sweeping the front step with a pine bough. Holden came out a little later, tying his coat at the waist. I'll take the sled down to the creek, see if the trap lines held. Do you want company? He hesitated, then nodded. If the little ones can spare you. Daisy was already braiding Daniel's hair inside, and the boy seemed content with her motherly fussing. Caroline pulled on her shawl and gloves, and they set off. The sled creaked behind them as they moved through the trees. The hush was thick, broken only by the sound of their boots crunching snow. Do you ever get lonely out here? She asked. I did. Not anymore. She looked over, caught the barest twitch at the corner of his mouth, the only sign of what he meant. At the creek, they found 2 rabbits caught in the snares. Holden dispatched them quick, his movements clean and practiced. Caroline helped him dress them, her fingers steady. You don't flinch, he said. I've done worse. They didn't speak again for a while. On the walk back, the sky split with geese heading south, their calls echoing across the basin. Caroline tilted her face to watch them, the cold air sharp against her cheeks. She reached for Holden's hand, not thinking, just acting. He didn't draw away. His fingers closed around hers, warm through the gloves. They walked that way the rest of the way home, not speaking, but something had shifted. Not loud, not sudden, just certain, like ice thickening on still water, like something lasting. By late November, the sun barely rose above the treetops before dipping again behind them, casting long blue shadows across the snow-packed clearing. Holden had begun setting lanterns earlier in the day, trimming wicks with a knife so worn it had no shine left. Caroline spent the evenings sewing small cloth bags to hang above the hearth, filling them with dried mint and spruce needles to keep the air fresh. The quiet between them had changed. It was no longer the hush of strangers, but the calm of people who had come to know the shape of each other's presence, how Holden's boots always landed heel first when he approached the porch, or how Caroline paused just before speaking, as though weighing whether the truth was ready to be spoken aloud. That morning, Holden brought in a stack of willow branches, snow clinging to his collar. You ever build snowshoes? He asked, setting the bundle down by the wall. Not proper ones, Caroline said, brushing flour from her hands. My brother tried once. He used rawhide and willow, but they broke on the first trail. Holden nodded. We'll do better than that. She watched as he crouched near the stove, pulling out a coil of sinew from a pouch. It had taken her weeks to get used to how little he explained his plans, how he simply moved through his tasks without ceremony, but now that quiet felt like trust. You always know what to do, she said, folding a damp cloth over the rising dough. No, he said, but I know how to try. Daisy sat near the shuttered window, drawing lines in a patch of frost with her finger. Daniel, curled beneath one of the quilts, whispered a song he claimed he'd heard in his sleep. Holden looked at them both, then at Caroline. I filed a land claim 6 years ago, he said. Took the better part of a year to clear the rocks, get the soil to take. Built this place on a flat of pine where the wind breaks easier. Figured I'd make something last. She didn't answer at first. The dough in her hands was soft and warm, alive beneath her fingers. And did it? She asked. Last. Not the way I meant it to. Caroline turned, resting her hands on the table. And now, he stood, brushing snow from his sleeves. Now it feels like it might. Later that afternoon, with the sky already dimming and the wind rising in the trees, Holden asked Caroline to walk with him up the ridge behind the barn. Daisy and Daniel stayed with the hound, who had taken to guarding them like it was his charge. The climb was steep in places, and the snow had crusted over, making their steps deliberate and slow. When they reached the top, Caroline drew her shawl tighter, her cheeks flushed from the cold. From the ridge, the land opened wide frozen riverbeds winding through the trees, smoke curling from the chimney far below, the mountains carved sharp against the sky. I come up here when I need reminding, Holden said. Of what? That all this doesn't belong to me, that I'm just passing through. Caroline stood beside him, her breath white in the air. You could have left too, after the first winter, after the crops failed, after whatever happened. I didn't. Why? He didn't answer. Not right away. Then his voice came quiet. Because I wanted this place to mean something. Even if it was just to me. They stood that way for a long while, the wind pulling at their coats, the sun slipping behind the peaks. Caroline reached out, her gloved hand finding his. I said once this cabin wasn't much, she said. But I was wrong. Holden turned toward her, brows drawn. What changed? You're in it, she said. His hand tightened around hers. They walked back down under the first stars, the snow crunching beneath their boots. When they reached the porch, Holden paused. I'm thinking of building on. There's enough cut stone near the creek. Could add a second room come spring. Caroline looked up at him, the lantern light catching in her eyes. That sounds like something a man would do if he planned to stay. I do, he said. If you do. She stepped close enough to feel the heat from his chest through her coat. Then we've both found where we belong. When he kissed her, it was slow, certain, like everything else he did without rush, without doubt. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. Daniel stirred in his sleep. Daisy had tucked her drawing beneath the quilt, a picture of 4 figures standing beneath pine trees, hand in hand. Caroline picked it up and held it to her chest. And for the first time in years, she felt the ache in her bones ease. Not from rest, but from the knowing that she no longer had to carry everything alone. The first thaw came in the second week of March, not with warmth but with silence, the kind that follows after months of wind clawing at the eaves. That morning, Holden stepped outside before sunrise and found the snow crusted but sinking at the edges, water running in thin trickles under the drift near the porch. When he came back in, Caroline was already stirring oats over the fire, her sleeves pushed to her elbows, her hair still loose from sleep. You hear the runoff? He asked, hanging his coat. She nodded, not turning. It's in the walls, like the logs are listening. He stepped closer, catching the scent of wood smoke in her skin, clean from melted snow. You always say things like that. Like what? Like the world's got ears. She glanced over her shoulder. Maybe it does. Daisy was still asleep, curled like a kitten under the quilts. Daniel had risen early and sat at the table with a spoon in one hand and a pine shaving in the other, carving lines into the wood. He hadn't stopped growing since winter began, and his sleeves barely reached his wrists now. After breakfast, Holden hitched his sled to the mule and made ready for town. They were nearly out of coffee and salt, and Caroline had written out a list with careful marks, her penmanship tight and slanted. She handed it to him folded in half. I don't need anything fancy, she said. I know, he replied, tucking it into his coat. She lingered at the door as he pulled on his gloves. Be careful crossing the low stream if the thaws started. The ice might give. I'll test it with the pole. She hesitated, then reached for his scarf, adjusting it without a word. Her hand lingered a moment longer than needed. He looked down at her. You want me to bring anything back for you? She shook her head. Just come back. He leaned in, brushed his lips against her forehead. Always. It took him the better part of the day to reach the trading post in Butte. The roads were sludge, and twice he had to stop and dig out the runners. By the time he arrived, the sun was low and the town quiet under the weight of spring's slow return. When Holden returned late the next evening, his coat stiff with ice and his beard rimed with melt, he found the cabin warm and lit and the smell of bread thick in the air. Caroline met him at the door. You're late. He handed her the parcel with the coffee and salt. Took longer than I planned. I brought something else. He reached into his coat and drew out a small tin box, the kind used to store buttons or wrapped sugar. Inside was a length of green ribbon, the exact shade of the fir trees behind the ridge. She looked at it, then at him. What's this for? You said once you'd lost your comb. I figured this do until we carve you another. She touched the ribbon with her fingertips, slow. It's too fine. No, he said. It's right. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Holden sat by the fire, oiling the hinges on the door. Caroline joined him with a cup of broth, her hand steady as she passed it to him. You never told me what made you stay out here after everything, she said. He set the cup down beside him. My brother died clearing the far meadow. He was older, thought he could break the land faster than it wanted. I buried him myself. She sat beside him, folding her legs beneath her. You built all this alone? I tried to sell once. Couldn't. Then the war passed through, and I didn't have anything left but this place. She picked up the cup, took a sip, then handed it back. You said this land didn't belong to you, that you were just passing through. I think I meant that I didn't expect it to feel like home. She studied him in the firelight. And now, he turned to her, his voice low. Now I know it never did until you walked into it. She didn't answer right away. The fire snapped, and from the far room came the soft sound of Daniel's breathing. Caroline reached into her pocket and drew out a folded square of cloth. Inside was the ribbon he'd given her. She tied it into her hair, her fingers working quick. You're not the only one who buried someone, she said. I lost a sister to the fever, a baby I never held long enough to name. But out here with you, I don't wake each day waiting for the next loss. Holden set down the cup and reached for her hand. We build forward. That's all we can do. She leaned in, resting her brow against his. Then let's build something that holds. Outside, the snow dripped from the pines like thawed breath. The river would rise in the coming weeks, and the soil would soften. But inside the cabin, the quiet had changed again, not an emptiness, but a fullness, as though nothing more needed to be said to know what had been chosen. By late April, the thaw had turned the ground soft and dark, the scent of wet earth rising through the air like something waking from a long sleep. Caroline raked through the garden bed behind the cabin with sleeves rolled and her palms blistered raw. Daniel and Daisy crouched nearby, sorting stones from the soil. The children had taken to the work without complaint, their hands as quick as their questions. Holden came from the woods dragging a young cedar trunk over his shoulder. His coat was tied around his waist, sweat darkening the back of his shirt. He set the trunk down beside the frame he'd begun near the edge of the clearing, where he'd marked a square of ground with string and stakes. That's the last one, he said, wiping his brow. Caroline straightened, brushing dirt from her skirt. How many more do you think we'll need? Maybe 6 if the ground holds. less if we brace the far side with stone. She picked up a spade and tested the edge. You still think the roof should pitch west? He nodded. Wind comes off the ridge harder in summer. Westward slope'll hold truer. Daisy looked up. What's it going to be? Holden crouched beside her. A room for your ma. Daniel frowned. Why does she need her own room? Caroline smiled faintly. It's not just for me. Holden met her gaze. No. It's for all of us. That night, after the children had been tucked into quilts freshly aired in the sun, Caroline stepped out onto the porch, the lantern behind her casting a warm glow across the floorboards. Holden leaned against the post, sharpening a chisel slowly, the rasping sound steady, almost soothing. She leaned beside him. You've been quiet. I've been thinking. She waited. I want to marry you, he said. Not just live beside you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and certain. I figured you'd ask in a field or under the stars, she said softly. I figured I'd ask where we built everything else. She turned toward him, eyes searching. You sure? I was sure the first time you handed me coffee and didn't flinch when I told you the truth. She reached for his hand, calloused and warm. We'd need a preacher. There's one rides out from Helena every few months. I can go meet him halfway. And the children? They've already chosen you. I'm just catching up. She laughed, quiet and full, the sound low in her throat. Then yes. If you're asking, my answer's yes. Holden kissed her, firm and slow. The night wrapped around them, cool and clean, the first stars blinking above the trees. 3 weeks later, the preacher arrived on horseback, his coat dusted in pollen and his boots scuffed from the trail. He stood beneath the new beams of the addition, still unshingled, and read the words steady from a leather-bound book. Daniel held the ring Holden had carved from deer antler, and Daisy scattered wildflowers over the packed earth. Caroline wore the green ribbon in her hair, and her hands didn't tremble when she said the vows. Afterward, they cut slices from the honey cake she'd baked that morning and passed tin cups of cider between neighbors who'd come from as far as 20 miles. The sun slid low behind the pines, casting gold across the faces of the people gathered. Someone played a tune on a fiddle, slow and sweet. As dusk deepened, Holden took Caroline's hand and led her behind the cabin where the hills rose and the grass had begun to green. You remember when I told you I come up here to be reminded? He asked. She nodded. He wrapped his arm around her waist. Now I come here to be grateful. She leaned into him, her voice soft. It's not just you anymore. No, he said. It's us. They stood that way until the fiddler stopped and the lanterns flickered out, until the earth cooled and the silence settled again. That summer, the walls of the new room were finished, chinked and sealed. Caroline lined the shelves with dried herbs and her few books. Holden built her a table near the window where she could write or mend or simply sit and watch the children chase each other across the yard. He carved her a new comb from birch, smooth and polished, and left it on her pillow without a word. The garden took that year. Squash and beans climbed the stakes, and the potatoes came in thick. Caroline taught Daisy to braid onions for drying. Daniel learned to whittle, his fingers nimble and precise. Holden came home one evening from checking the fence line and found Caroline asleep on the porch swing, Daniel curled beside her, and Daisy reading aloud from one of the books. He stood there a long time before going inside, the peace of it settling into his bones like warmth. They never spoke much about what had come before, not because it didn't matter, but because what they'd built together mattered more. Years passed. The children grew strong and curious. More neighbors came, and the land gave back what they put in. The cabin never emptied again. And some nights, when the wind moved just right through the trees, Holden would take Caroline's hand and lead her to the ridge above their home, where they stood together in the hush, wrapped in the life they'd made, and watched the stars keep watch over all of it.